Julia thought she had it all under control. But when betrayal hit her from all sides, she realized too late she was trapped. Eli, her husband, had a plan all along, and he wasn't alone. As the pieces fell into place, the truth was more devastating than she could have imagined. What happens when revenge is colder than she ever expected? Julia's world is about to crumble, but is there a twist she didn't see coming? Eli stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the dark city shimmering below, but his thoughts were far away. Just a few hours ago, his heart had been racing as he looked at his wife, Julia. But now, he felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. He couldn't believe it. They were married, and he had convinced himself that their relationship was real, that she loved him just as much as he loved her. But everything changed when he found that tape. The shock was something he couldn't process right away. He wasn't even prepared for what he was about to see on that video. The betrayal she had committed before their wedding was horrifying. She had told him she was just going to a bachelorette party, that it would be fun and innocent. But what he saw on that recording turned his world upside down. Julia, his loving and beautiful wife, whom he had almost lost after years of chasing her attention, had betrayed him with other men. The video was clear and undeniable. She hadn't even tried to hide her betrayal. He heard her laughter, saw how she spent time with other guys, hugging them, and even more. It was a shock. How could she? How had he not noticed anything? And he had truly forgiven her. All those conversations, all those reassurances that it was just a mistake. He refused to believe that Julia was capable of something like that. They continued living together, and though he could never forget that moment, he chose to leave it in the past. It was one of those situations where love tried to overshadow reality. He attempted to rebuild trust, but unfortunately, it was only a matter of time. Time passed, and everything started repeating itself. Julia was just as beautiful as ever, always attracting men's attention. Eli couldn't help but notice how often her eyes wandered toward other men. It wasn't just a coincidence. She was constantly fascinated by others, but he tried to ignore it. He was afraid that her love for him might fade, so he continued living in a world of illusions. And then they went on a trip to a mountain resort together. He thought it would be a perfect getaway. They decided to take a break from their routine, escape daily problems, and simply enjoy each other's company. But things didn't go as he had hoped. The resort was breathtaking, with mountain landscapes, fresh air, and a perfect atmosphere for romance. They met a couple who seemed very open and friendly, and they started spending time together. Shared dinners, walks through the forest, and late-night conversations. Everything seemed fine, but Eli had a nagging feeling that something was off. One evening, as everyone gathered on the veranda with glasses of wine, he noticed Julia becoming more open and flirtatious. Her behavior was so obvious that he couldn't ignore it. She laughed at the men's jokes, her hands constantly touching their shoulders, and every glance she gave carried a certain kind of energy. Eli didn't understand why he felt this way. He tried talking to her about it, but she brushed him off, saying it was all just a joke, and that she had no intention of flirting with anyone. The evening went on, and he slowly lost control of his emotions. He couldn't believe it was happening again. Julia seemed unable to resist the allure of attractive looks. And then, when everyone was a little drunk, the thing he feared the most happened. He saw Julia walk off into the woods with one of the men. At first, he wanted to follow them, but then he decided to let it go. He had been trying to leave everything in the past, but he could no longer hide his pain. He went to their room, sat on the bed, and thought about everything. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened the next day. Eli, once again disillusioned, saw Julia return to their room with the same man, and he realized that this wasn't just innocent flirting. It was betrayal again. But this time, he wasn't alone. That night, drunk on wine, he had met another woman in their group. They started talking, and then they became close. And now, he was facing the reality that she was pregnant with his child. What was he supposed to do now? Eli woke up the next morning with a headache and the feeling that everything that had happened yesterday was just a nightmare. He barely remembered what had occurred that night, and he didn't want to talk about it. But one thing remained clear in his mind: the woman he had met at the resort and what had happened when alcohol erased the line between truth and desire. She was pregnant with his child. Eli tried to forget about it, but every time he looked at Julia, his heart clenched. He couldn't hide the anger and pain he felt. Yesterday had become a turning point in his life. Now, he was faced with the question of what to do next. Lost in thought, Eli decided not to tell Julia about the woman's pregnancy. Instead, he chose to handle the situation differently. Julia continued acting as if nothing had happened. She was once again affectionate, caring, and Eli couldn't tell whether she truly knew nothing or if this was just her way of manipulating the situation to keep things as they were. But no matter what, he knew one thing: she had to pay for her betrayal. Eli wasn't a vengeful man, but this time, he decided that he needed to take careful, calculated steps to make Julia understand that her betrayal wouldn't go unpunished. He gathered his strength and began to act. Eli started involving Julia in more and more activities that required her full attention. He organized several romantic evenings, making her believe she had all of his focus. He became even more attentive, even more caring. It all seemed like a classic approach, but in reality, Eli was preparing a small, unnoticed trap for his wife. He subtly manipulated the situation, making Julia feel completely safe and confident, even leading her to believe that he had forgotten about her betrayal. Eli knew that her biggest fear was being caught in a situation where her past mistakes would bring his anger back. He understood that she would try to control everything, but she had no idea that Eli was setting up a plan to catch her red-handed. One day, when they were both getting ready for an important event, Eli decided that this would be his moment. He arranged the details so that it looked natural, just like an ordinary evening for the two of them, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of his plan. When they arrived at the venue, he acted as if everything was fine. They went to the party, where Julia was well acquainted with everyone. He carefully observed her behavior, listening intently to whom she talked to and who caught her attention. It quickly became clear that, as always, she was the center of attention, and she started flirting with one of the guests. Eli watched with a cold expression, but his heart was already pounding faster. That evening, when Julia left for another room, Eli quickly pulled out his phone and sent a text to the same girl he had slept with at the resort. He asked her to meet him that very night. The girl gladly agreed. Eli followed through and met with her, spending a few moments together. He never thought it would happen so quickly and effortlessly, but it allowed him to return to his wife feeling like he was now in control. He felt free, able to do whatever he wanted. After some time, Julia returned and saw Eli sitting calmly with a smile on his face. She had no idea that, at that very moment, his betrayal was complete. Eli remained composed and collected. She asked him why he looked like that. And then, as if casually, he mentioned how he had spent time with another woman that night. Julia immediately became nervous, asking what had happened. Eli looked at her calmly and replied that it was simply a solution to a situation she herself had created. Her face changed, and she started making excuses, but Eli was no longer listening. His cold gaze was fixed on her, and he took a certain satisfaction in seeing her on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Now that Julia was trying to apologize and beg for forgiveness, Eli could finally tell her what he had been keeping inside all this time. He was not the kind of man who would simply give up. He was ready to turn all the cards in his favor. Julia stood before Eli, confused, her eyes filled with fear. She couldn't understand what he was trying to tell her. Her heart raced, and she felt the ground slipping from under her feet. From the moment Eli mentioned his night with another woman, she began to realize that she no longer had control over the situation. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with nervousness. Eli sat calmly, watching her reaction, no longer intending to hide anything. He knew she was expecting apologies or understanding from him, but that was not his goal. Instead, he replied coldly and confidently. "You wanted freedom, didn't you? You wanted to keep lying and cheating, thinking I would never find out. Now I know everything. You are not the only one playing games. I'm not staying on the sidelines either." Julia started shifting nervously, feeling her plan crumble. She tried to find words to justify herself, but she couldn't say anything because she knew her lies had already been exposed. She was not prepared for this turn of events. "Eli, you don't understand. It was just one time. It happened under the influence of alcohol. I didn't mean for this to happen." Julia tried to justify herself. Eli paused for a moment, as if considering her words. His face remained as cold as before. There was no emotion in his eyes, only a clear understanding that everything he had done was necessary. "And what? I'm supposed to believe it was a mistake? That it was just a slip from your perfect little world? Are you serious?" he asked, looking her straight in the eyes. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness in it. Julia felt like she had been trapped, and now her options were limited. She realized she had lost all her power. Eli was calm, but he was no longer the same man. He was a man who no longer believed her words. She had no control over him anymore. "I'm begging you, Eli, give me another chance. I love you." She took a step toward him, but he stopped her with his gaze. "You love me?" And where was your love when you were choosing other men? When you decided you could do whatever you wanted, and I would just stay silent? You already made all the decisions for us, and now it's just up to me to decide how I will act next. Julia stood frozen, not knowing what to do. She felt a fear she hadn't experienced in a long time. All her plans, all her deceptions, all her manipulations were exposed, and now she was at the mercy of the man she once trusted, only to realize that it was her own trust that had been betrayed first. Eli knew she wouldn't just stand still. She would try to manipulate him again, to turn everything back in her favor. But he was ready for it. He knew he had everything under control. I can't be with you anymore, Julia, he said calmly, but there was unwavering determination in his voice. He took a deep breath, as if releasing all the weight that had been holding him back, and for a moment, he felt relief. This was the decision he had made, and now he no longer needed to waste time thinking. Eli, don't do this. You know I made a mistake. I want to fix everything. I really do. She started grabbing his hands, but he pushed her away. You cheated on me more than once, Julia, and I'm no longer willing to forgive, he said with firm resolve in his voice. Julia fell to her knees, her eyes filled with tears. She knew this couldn't be undone. She had lost everything. Her reputation, her love, her chance at a future with Eli. All her attempts, all her manipulations had failed. I can't believe in you again, Eli added with cruel calmness. And though he spoke without emotion, his words carried great weight. Julia realized that her chance to escape the consequences was over. Meanwhile, his thoughts remained with another woman, the one who had recently told him she was pregnant. Eli felt the weight of this revelation. He was ready to act and not let his life be ruined. And while his heart was filled with anger toward Julia, he no longer felt anything for her except disappointment. He looked at her one last time and walked away. He was ready to start a new life, leaving no room for betrayal and lies. But many trials still lay ahead, and he knew he would have to face those who had become part of this story, including the woman carrying his child. Julia was left alone, completely lost and hopelessly broken. Eli didn't look back as he left the house. He knew he would no longer seek Julia's forgiveness. She had long since destroyed what they had built together. The real truth was far worse than he had imagined. Every glance, every touch, every word she had spoken to him now seemed like nothing more than a mask. Eli was convinced that there was no room left for her lies in his life. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't need a plan. His intuition guided him forward, and he felt that the decision he had made was the right one. The night was dark, but he didn't feel the cold. He was consumed by his own thoughts. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to go back to Julia, but leaving her without answers was no less difficult. He stopped at an intersection and thought for a moment. He was no longer the man he had been a few months ago. Everything had changed, and he needed to find a way to move on. He pulled out his phone and glanced at a message from the woman carrying his child. Now that he was alone, the news didn't seem as terrifying. She was pregnant, but this was a chance for him to start a new chapter in his life. He already knew he had to talk to her, but even that situation didn't seem as complicated as what had happened with Julia. Are you coming home? She had texted. Eli sighed and typed a response. I can't talk right now, but we'll talk when I'm ready, he replied, locking his phone. It wasn't cruel, but in his heart, he felt certainty. He had no more doubts. Eli snapped back to reality. He had wasted too much time trying to change Julia, to make her into the person he wanted by his side. And though he had no more doubts, the realization that life would go on was not an easy one. He didn't feel joy, but he no longer needed to grieve over what could have been. That life was no longer his. Meanwhile, Julia couldn't just let it go. She sat at home, replaying her choices over and over. She understood that she had made a terrible mistake, and even if she tried to justify her actions, it was meaningless. What tormented her even more was that she couldn't understand how she could betray a man like Eli. His love had been unwavering, and yet she had been willing to destroy it all for a fleeting moment of pleasure. But now, left alone, she began to see things she hadn't noticed before. She realized that she had always craved attention, but her goals were not what she had imagined them to be. Julia felt like she had lost everything. Eli, her dignity, her support. All her illusions had crumbled. She called him several times, but he didn't answer. And with each unanswered call, another blow struck her soul. And even when she tried to justify herself, It no longer mattered. Days passed, and Eli tried to figure out what to do next. Julia was behind him, but now he had a new responsibility. He was a father. Though the situation with the other woman was complicated, he had already decided that he had to move forward. He had no other choice. And now, the face of the future was entirely different from what he had once imagined. Eli decided to meet with the woman who was pregnant with his child. He knew this was a chance for a new life, and even though everything seemed complicated, he had nowhere to go back to. And while there was room in his heart to understand his role in this situation, he couldn't change the past. Julia could no longer sit at home, watching her life fall apart before her eyes. She set out to find Eli, hoping to reclaim at least a part of what they once had. But when she arrived, Eli was no longer home. She called him, but he didn't answer. She called again and again, but each time, there was only silence. At that moment, Julia realized that everything was already lost. Eli was ready to start a new chapter of his life. He stood on the edge of something new, but inside, he had more doubts than he cared to admit. Eli was trying to figure out what to do with his current situation. He had a new responsibility, fatherhood, which wasn't yet legally confirmed but already felt real with every step he took. However, the pain of what had happened between him and Julia lingered. If only he could turn back time and avoid that betrayal. But now, it was in the past, and he couldn't change it. Eli decided he needed a break. He drove to the coast, leaving the city behind. Maybe this was the best time for him to clear his head. He sat on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. The fresh air, the sound of the sea, the sense of freedom. This was all he needed right now. But inside his head, there was still a storm. Julia. She kept intruding into his thoughts, even as he tried to relax. Why did she do it? And he couldn't shake the question. Was she really the person he thought she was? Or had he just believed in her promises more than she deserved? There was no hatred in his heart, but there was disappointment, and somehow, that felt even worse. He called the woman who was carrying his child. He told her he wanted to talk. She agreed, and a few days later, they met at a cafe. She looked a bit tired. Her face showed no joy, but there was honesty in her eyes. This was a completely different situation from what he had with Julia. Eli understood that while this wasn't an ideal scenario, he had to take responsibility. So they began to talk. "We need to figure out what to do next," Eli said, looking at her with a serious expression. She nodded, and a pause settled between them. They both knew that life was changing forever, and there was no way to undo it, but what could they do about it? How could they know if they were ready for this together? "I understand that everything happened very fast, and that I wasn't ready for it," Eli continued, his voice a mix of determination and uncertainty. "But we have to figure this out if we want to move forward." She smiled, and her eyes softened. She felt that Eli wasn't treating this as an obligation. He wanted to do this. For both of them, this was a chance. But at that moment, Eli still didn't know how it would all turn out. He didn't know if he would be happy in his new role as a father, but he was ready for it. Meanwhile, Julia didn't stop trying to reach Eli. She did everything she could to restore their relationship, but Eli remained silent and distant. She sent him another message, but he didn't respond. She didn't know what else to do. Every day, Julia felt her life falling apart. She didn't even know how to explain her actions. She decided to go to his house, but when she arrived, he wasn't there. She stood in front of the door for a few minutes before leaving. But with each passing day, she realized more and more that she had already lost him. Not just because of her betrayal, but because she lacked the ability to understand what Eli truly wanted from their relationship. She always thought she could manipulate him, keep control, but it was much more complicated than she had imagined. And now, she understood that she had orchestrated her own downfall. One evening, as Eli sat by the shore, his phone rang. It was a call from Julia. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a note from his pocket, the one she had left for him a few days ago. Words that were probably meant to make him come back to her. But they had no power. Eli had already decided that he would no longer play these games. He looked at the sea and sighed, realizing that his path was no longer Julia's path. He wasn't seeking revenge, but he knew one thing: he could no longer be a part of her world. He had to start a new journey, with new people and new opportunities. And even though it wasn't easy, he felt that it was the right step. He sat in silence, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks. Eli hadn't felt this relaxed in a long time. All these weeks he had spent at the resort had become a break from the chaos that had consumed his life. Not long ago, he had been in the midst of a storm, an emotional storm that raged due to Julia's betrayal, which seemed to have no limits. But now, as he sat on the shore, everything felt different. His heart was calmer, though still uncertain. Julia no longer called. She had stepped back, and he wasn't ready to seek her out. Eli realized that his life had changed forever, and it was his decision to no longer be a part of hers. But how could he truly end it? How could he leave her behind without feeling like something was left unfinished? A few days ago, he met the woman who was pregnant with his child. She looked scared but also determined. Eli understood that she needed support, and he couldn't allow himself to deny it. She wasn't Julia, and their relationship couldn't be compared. They had their own history, their own unique dynamic, and this was a new responsibility he was ready to accept. Their meeting on the beach was one of those moments when real understanding begins to form between people, even without words. They simply sat next to each other, and the moment was filled with a kind of lightness that had previously been unattainable. Eli, she spoke first, breaking the silence. I don't want you to feel obligated. We can choose our own paths, and I understand that this is a difficult decision for you. He looked at her and saw not only confusion in her eyes, but also genuine concern. She wasn't trying to manipulate him, wasn't trying to blame him. She was simply a person trying to find her way through a complicated situation. I don't know what comes next, Eli replied, but I want to try. If it's possible, if we can both create a new life for ourselves, then I'm willing. It wasn't a promise, it was a choice. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he was ready to face it. After that conversation, Eli realized that his heart wasn't empty. He was simply going through a process of healing. All the emotions that had surfaced after Julia's betrayal hadn't vanished instantly, but they had become clearer, and he no longer felt trapped by his own emotions. For the next few days, he and the woman, whose name was Catherine, spent time together on the beach, walked through local cafes, trying to find common ground. Eli felt that their meeting wasn't just a coincidence, but it wasn't something final either. They didn't put any labels on their relationship, but there was already a thread of connection between them. He realized that this was an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. But life was never that simple. After he returned home, Julia was still in his mind. She resumed contact, sending messages, trying to call. And even though Eli didn't answer, he still couldn't shake off her influence. From time to time, he tried to forget her, but her calls always reminded him that something remained unfinished. One evening, Julia showed up at his house. Eli didn't answer the door at first, but after a few minutes, he felt that he had to see her, to say everything that had been building up over the past few weeks. She looked lost and exhausted. Her eyes were red from crying, and her voice trembled slightly. Eli, I want to fix everything. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry, but I want you to understand that I still love you. I know I made a mistake. You're my only one. Those words were undoubtedly heartfelt, but Eli could no longer believe in their sincerity. He couldn't return to the state where he blindly trusted her words. Now, he had a new responsibility and a new perspective on life. Julia, I can't go back to what we had. And I don't want to. You made your choice, and I made mine. We both have to move forward, he replied, looking straight into her eyes. I don't want revenge. I don't want resentment. I just want to live my life. These words weren't just a rejection, they were closure. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Eli realized that revenge wasn't worth it. What had happened between them couldn't be undone, but he wouldn't let the past dictate his future. Julia remained silent, her face showing pain and disappointment, but she knew he was right. She couldn't force him to return to what once was. And though it hurt, she understood that their paths had diverged forever. Eli closed the door behind her, and as he turned back into the room, he felt the heavy shadow that had been looming over him finally beginning to lift. Life moved forward, and though many obstacles still lay ahead, Eli was ready to face them. He sat on the couch, and even in the silence of his home, he felt his heart beating faster than usual. The room was cool, and his thoughts were like a storm, unpredictable and heavy. Last night's meeting with Julia, her apologies, her tears, it all weighed on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to manipulate him once again. There was no real repentance. She just wanted to reclaim what she had lost. And he could see it. But just a few minutes after she left his house, he received a new call. This time, it was Miles, an old friend of Julia's, with whom she had once worked at the same agency. He wasn't someone Eli took seriously, but Miles had always been useful in handling matters in the professional world. And in general, he was the kind of person who could provide a lot of valuable information. "Eli, there's something important you need to know," he said, his voice almost a whisper over the phone. Eli was slightly surprised. He hadn't expected Miles to be aware of what was happening in his personal life, but he could sense that he was about to deal with something big. "What happened?" Eli asked, his voice already carrying a note of seriousness. "I don't know how to say this, but I think you need to know the truth," Miles said. "What happened between you and Julia isn't really over. You need to know who else was involved in all of this." Eli felt his heart sink sharply. He knew Julia had cheated on him, and even though it was painful, he had already accepted that they both needed to move on. But this call from Miles wasn't an ordinary one. He felt as if there was still a dark corridor he hadn't looked into yet. "What do you mean?" Eli struggled to gather his thoughts. "You thought you were just one of the people she cheated on?" Miles asked with a hint of irony. "Not quite. You don't know who she was with when you weren't around." Eli felt something tighten inside him. He had long since stopped trusting Julia, but this new twist was shaking his confidence in his own assumptions once again. "I can't promise you much, but I found out that this isn't just about you," Miles continued. "It involves more than one man. And what happened between you two wasn't random." From Miles' words, Eli realized that this wasn't just simple infidelity. This was another deceitful scheme. And what Julia had done opened up new possibilities for revenge. This wasn't just betrayal. It was an entire plan. Eli didn't wait for more details. He knew he had to act quickly. "What should I do?" he asked. "I'll inform you. You need to find out more before making any decisions," Miles replied. "But just know, this isn't what you thought it was." The evening passed, and Eli felt as if the new details about his wife's betrayal were slipping through his fingers. All his previous assumptions became meaningless. What he had learned shattered all boundaries. Now he had a choice. He understood that this story wasn't over yet, and he had to take action. In the morning, he went to the cafe where he usually met with Miles. This meeting was supposed to be the key to his plan. When Eli sat down at the table, Miles was already waiting. His face was serious, and he wasn't hiding what he had in mind. "Do you understand what I meant?" Miles asked as Eli sat down next to him. "You thought your life was falling apart because of Julia's betrayal, but it's much more complicated than that." Eli was already prepared to hear even more unpleasant news. "She didn't just cheat on you. She was part of a bigger scheme that also involved some people from her circle," Miles explained. "I can't say much more, but know this, it was all part of her plan." Eli sat there, not knowing what to say. His mind was overwhelmed. This was more than just personal humiliation. "You need to understand one thing." Miles leaned in closer and looked him straight in the eyes. "You're not the only victim in this situation. And if you want revenge, it won't be a simple act. You can choose whether you'll be part of her world or if you'll step back and take control of everything yourself." Those words shook Eli. He didn't know what to do, but what Miles said next changed everything. Eli sat at the table, looking at his old friend Miles, listening to his words. They didn't offer any guarantees, but they pushed him toward action. Miles revealed that Julia had been playing this game for a long time, and her infidelity was just one part of a larger strategy that involved multiple men, even some of her friends. This was far more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Eli had no more doubts. He knew that his revenge had to be refined, calculated. He couldn't just act emotionally, he needed a plan. He wasn't going to leave Julia a single chance or an opportunity to return to the world where she had manipulated him and everyone around her. That evening, Eli decided to act. He reached out to an old acquaintance, a lawyer who had helped him a few times in the past. They met in a neutral location, a cafe, to discuss the next steps. He knew that Julia valued her wealth, her image, and her freedom above all else. And he understood that he could take it all away. Just a few well-placed documents and strategic moves, and her life would change forever. Eli worked for hours, preparing all the necessary legal documents. He knew that what would hurt Julia the most was not just that her betrayal had been exposed to him, but that it would be revealed to everyone she knew. And he was counting on that. All these years, Julia had considered herself untouchable, believing that her perfect image and empty promises were enough to keep her safe. The next day, Eli invited Julia to a restaurant. He didn't tell her anything specific, only that he wanted to talk. Julia, of course, suspected nothing, so she put on her best dress, chose her finest accessories, and headed to the restaurant, hoping it would be another dinner in the style of pretending everything is fine. She sat down at the table, and within minutes, her gaze became hazy when she saw Eli turning very serious, as if something important and unpleasant was about to happen. "What do you want, Eli?" she asked, forcing herself to appear calm. She didn't realize she was no longer as strong as she wanted to seem. Eli looked at her coldly, but without anger. He understood that everything between them was already destroyed, and his only goal now was to ensure Julia could never manipulate him again. "I need you to look at this," he said, pulling documents out of a folder and placing them in front of her. Julia, seeing the documents, nervously twitched her fingers. She realized they contained something very important, but she couldn't even imagine how much this would cost her. "Is this all you've got?" "I don't have time for your games, Eli," she said, trying to hide her nervousness. "You still think you can get away with everything?" Eli asked calmly, looking her straight in the eyes. He saw her face begin to change as she started to realize that the situation was far more serious than she had imagined. "I know everything, Julia," he continued. "I know everything you've done. How you cheated on me with several men. I know who helped you. And now I'm taking you to court." Julia was frightened. Her hands started to tremble. She tried to hide her emotions, but it was no longer working. "What do you want, Eli?" she asked in confusion, feeling her life begin to crumble. Her image, her public reputation, everything she had built over the years, it could all fall apart in an instant. Eli looked at her, and all pity disappeared from his eyes. "I want you to feel what it's like to lose everything," he said coldly. He took out several photos and placed them in front of her. They were pictures from that night at the resort when Julia had cheated on him with other men. And most importantly, they included photos of her with her other lovers and friends, all of them in the same bed. All her hidden affairs were now exposed. Eli had already sent these photos to several of her closest friends and public figures so that everyone who had admired her would learn the truth. "This is just the beginning," Eli said as Julia clutched her head, trying to process what was happening. Julia was in shock. Her perfect world, her reputation, it was all destroyed. But Eli already knew this would be enough for her to realize that he was no longer the man he used to be. "Now you have to explain yourself, Julia. And that will be your punishment, being alone with your own conscience," Eli added as he stood up. He left her in the restaurant, sitting alone, her face transformed, but this was only the beginning of what she would have to endure. The next day, Eli woke up early, feeling a chill on his skin. The meeting with Julia had left him with mixed emotions. He didn't feel joy about what he had done. Everything had gone exactly as he had planned, but something was missing. It felt like, even though he had found some relief, the emotions didn't bring him true satisfaction. It was all too easy. He had seen Julia shaking from shock, but she wasn't ready for everything that was yet to come. When Eli sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, new messages appeared before him. All of them were from Julia's acquaintances, former friends who were now trying to smile in his face, apologizing for supporting her deception. Eli no longer trusted any of them, even though they had once felt like family. He shut his laptop and looked out the window. It was still morning, but he felt like he had already lived through this entire day. Everything was like a kaleidoscope, small pieces of his old life crumbling, and none of it mattered anymore. Eli got dressed, put on his suit, grabbed the documents, and headed to the office. He wasn't going to work. He was just taking the final necessary steps to completely close this chapter. His heart beat steadily, without any unnecessary excitement. He knew he had done the right thing. When Eli arrived at his lawyer's office, he once again saw a familiar face. Mike, the attorney he had worked with in the past, looked like he was ready for a major battle, even if it required diving into all the details of this case. They sat down at the table, where new documents were already prepared. These papers contained everything from proof of infidelity to legal statements, from evidence to audio recordings and photographs. "This is your last chance, Eli," Mike said, looking at him seriously. "You have the opportunity to end this once and for all. But you have to be prepared for all the consequences." Eli nodded, understanding that his actions would lead to significant changes. But he was ready for it. After Julia had seen the pictures and realized she was losing her good name, she had no choice but to start defending herself. But she didn't know that Eli had one more unexpected move prepared. Eli gathered himself and drove to the house where Julia was staying, trying to shield her reputation and avoid public discussions. He learned that she had arranged a meeting with lawyers to try and resolve the situation, but her attorneys stood no chance against the documents he had prepared. When he entered the apartment, Julia was sitting on the couch. Her face had changed, but she remained the same, calm and stubborn. She lifted her eyes when she saw Eli and realized that she could no longer escape the truth. "You came again to threaten me?" she asked indifferently, though there was a hint of nervousness in her voice. Eli didn't answer right away. He sat in front of her, pulled out another envelope, and placed it on the table. Julia looked at him, and then at the envelope. She didn't understand what it was. "This is your last chance, Julia. If you want to keep at least something of what you have, start telling the truth," Eli said, looking her in the eyes. Julia knew her reputation was already in question. Not just hers, but her family's as well. The same people who had supported her lies would now know the truth. Eli couldn't help but notice the panic appearing on her face. He saw how she was trying to convince herself that she still had a way out. "What do you want from me, Eli? I did everything for you. Do you want me to take back all those files? For us to be together again?" She tried to manipulate him, but it no longer worked. Eli didn't waver. "You betrayed me, Julia. And now I'll show you what it's like when everything you thought you had is gone." He picked up the envelope and began to open it. Inside was a document, certified by a notary and prepared according to all legal standards. It was a contract that would put an end to her career. If Julia failed to provide satisfactory explanations or couldn't restore her reputation, this document would immediately come into effect and completely liquidate all her assets. Julia's temper flared, her lips trembled. She couldn't hold back the tears rolling down her cheeks. "How can you be so cruel? I loved you," she cried. Eli looked at her, and there was no room for pity in his eyes. "I don't love you anymore, Julia. And you did this to yourself." Julia opened the envelope, and suddenly, her face went pale. Inside wasn't just a legal agreement. It was a copy of a contract with an investment company that she had signed months ago, using Eli's assets as collateral. Her hands trembled. She slowly lifted her eyes, trying to understand how this was possible. She thought that document was long gone. But the biggest shock came when she saw the name of the person who now owned everything, Eli. Her voice cracked. You own everything?" Eli just smiled. "Oh, that's not even the worst part, Julia. Look closer at the last page." Julia flipped the page and froze. Below the signatures, there was a clause written in fine print. In the event of divorce, all property, including business and personal assets, will be fully transferred to Eli Sanders without the right to contest. Her lips moved soundlessly. She tried to say something, but no words came out. Her business, apartment, car, everything now belonged to him. Everything she had deceived for was now his. "How? This can't be. You didn't even know about the deal," she screamed, throwing the document onto the table. But Eli calmly watched her, as if he were watching a play he had written himself. "Oh, I knew, Julia. I knew before you even signed it. Miles, your oh-so-loyal partner, help me. Did you really think he'd risk his career for you? He sold you out before we even started this game." Julia staggered back as if she had been struck. "Miles, that's a lie. He loves me." Her voice cracked, but Eli just shook his head. "Loves you? Do you really believe that? He took his share last month. He has a new project now, without you." Julia collapsed onto the couch, pressing her hands to her head. Her life was crumbling before her eyes. But Eli wasn't finished yet. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, pulling out his phone and playing a video. On the screen, a party, loud music, laughter, and Julia. She was hugging Miles, whispering something in his ear. The camera slowly panned to show Eli himself, standing on a balcony, recording everything on his phone. Julia froze. You were there?" she whispered. "Yes, I saw everything. But that's not all. This video will be on your blog tomorrow. All your followers, brands, and partners, they'll all know who you really were." Her eyes widened in horror. "You wouldn't dare. Try and stop me," Eli said coldly. Julia stood up, swaying. "I can explain. Eli, give me a chance." "Explain? You lied to me for years. You destroyed our life for quick money and fake emotions. Why should I listen to you?" She stepped closer, trying to grab his hand. "You loved me." "I did," he interrupted. "That time has passed. Now I love my freedom." Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Eli, without changing his expression, opened it. Standing on the doorstep was Miles, confused and anxious. Seeing Julia, he took a step back. "Miles, what are you doing here?" Julia looked at him fearfully. Eli smiled, extending a hand to Miles. "Came to meet your new partner, right?" Miles shrugged, avoiding Julia's gaze. "Sorry, Julia. Business is business. You ruined everything yourself." Julia slowly sat down, staring at the floor. It was over. Eli, stopping near the door, turned back one last time. Oh, and one more thing. Remember that apartment by the ocean you dreamed about? It's mine too. I think Miles and I will have a great time there this weekend. Julia lifted her head. No, she whispered. You can't. Eli smiled. Oh, I already did. He walked out, and the door closed behind him. Julia was left alone. Her career, her reputation, her relationships, everything was lost. The room was silent, disturbed only by the echoes of her shattered dreams. But then her phone vibrated. The number was unknown. She pressed the answer button. A voice on the other end spoke. Julia, we know about your deal. And if you don't return the money, we'll come for you. Julia's eyes widened in horror. She glanced at the table, where the document with Eli's signature lay. It was over. She had lost everything. Meanwhile, Eli stood on the balcony of his new oceanfront penthouse, watching the sunset and smiling. A good revenge takes time, he whispered. Then his phone lit up with a new message. It was from Miles. She doesn't know about the last clause in the contract. When they call her, it's only the beginning. Eli grinned. The game continues. Julia sat in the dark room, staring at her phone screen in shock. After the call, she received a message. 72 hours. If the money isn't there, expect visitors. Her heart pounded. She lifted her eyes to the document with Eli's signature. She thought this was the end, but now she realized things could get even worse. Who were these people? What would they do? And how was Miles involved in all of this? Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Julia flinched. Who could it be in the middle of the night? She slowly approached the door and, holding her breath, peeked through the peephole. No one was there, but on the floor lay a small black envelope. She opened the door, nervously glancing around, and picked it up. Inside was a photograph, an image of Eli, Miles, and a woman she didn't recognize. On the back, a note read, Did you really think this was just about revenge? Look closer. Julia stared at the woman's face in the photo. Her hands trembled. This was impossible. She knew that face. It was Sophie, her former best friend, the one she had fallen out with over an old scandal. But what was she doing with Eli and Miles? Her phone vibrated again. Look out the window. Julia yanked the curtains aside. Outside, a black SUV was parked on the street. Eli stepped out of the car. But he wasn't alone. Sophie was with him. They were laughing. Miles stood nearby, talking on the phone. Eli lifted his head and looked straight at her window. His smile was cold and confident. He raised his hand and waved at her. Julia stumbled back from the window, her breathing quick and shallow. What the hell is going on? She whispered. Feeling like everything was spiraling out of control, she grabbed her phone again. The latest message made her blood run cold. The game is over. We're coming for what belongs to us. Get ready to face the truth, Julia. Sophie will explain everything, if she has time. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, trying to process what she had just read. If she has time? What did that mean? Suddenly, the lights in her apartment went out. Julia spun around sharply. Another knock on the door. Who's there? She shouted, but there was only silence. Then she heard a voice. Quiet, familiar, but cold. Hello, Julia. It's been a long time. It was Sophie. The door slowly creaked open, and a shadowy figure appeared in the darkness. Are you ready to hear the whole truth? The voice echoed. And then, a sharp sound of breaking glass came from the back room. Julia turned her head and realized she was trapped. The end? What would you do in Eli's place after such an ending?